The intersection of personal trauma and public disclosure creates moments that transcend entertainment. Moments when the boundaries between performance and authentic human response dissolve completely. And moments when bearing witness to another person's survival requires abandoning professional distance in favor of genuine emotional engagement. Military service frequently involves experiences that defy civilian comprehension, situations where the line between life and death becomes so thin that crossing back requires not only physical endurance but psychological resilience that may take decades to fully develop. These narratives remind us that survival is not merely a matter of continuing to breathe, but rather involves the complex work of integrating traumatic experience into ongoing life. That those who survive catastrophic events carry invisible wounds that shape every subsequent day, and that sharing survival stories publicly represents an act of courage that demands respectful witnessing rather than casual consumption. Recognition of the profound nature of military trauma, acknowledgement of the long-term consequences of combat and operational experiences, and commitment to supporting veterans as they navigate the aftermath of survival should inform our response to these testimonies. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Hayes, United States Navy retired, appeared on the Family Feud stage during Veterans Week at 48 years old with physical presentation that immediately communicated significant medical history despite his otherwise healthy appearance. Extensive scarring visible on his neck and hands, a slight asymmetry in his facial features suggesting reconstructive surgery, and movement patterns indicating chronic pain management all signaled that Marcus had experienced trauma of considerable magnitude. His team consisted of his wife Catherine, their 2 adult children, his younger brother, and his longtime friend and former Navy colleague who had been present during the incident that would become the focus of the episode. Steve Harvey conducted standard pre-game interviews with professional warmth, asking Marcus about his Navy service and thanking him for his dedication to the nation. The inquiry into Marcus's military background began conventionally enough. Steve asked about the duration and nature of his service, and Marcus explained that he had served 22 years in the Navy, primarily as a naval aviator flying F-18 Super Hornets from aircraft carriers during multiple deployments to the Persian Gulf and other operational theaters. Standard responses that characterized many Veterans Week participants. Steve then posed what appeared to be a routine follow-up question about memorable experiences from Marcus's service, expecting perhaps an interesting deployment story or a comment about carrier operations. The question opened a door that Marcus had apparently decided, after years of keeping his survival story private, to walk through publicly. Marcus's expression shifted from polite game, show participation, to something far more serious and internal. His response carried weight that immediately altered the atmosphere in the studio. He explained that he needed to share something he had not discussed publicly before, that his appearance on Family Feud represented a deliberate choice to speak about an experience that had defined the past 15 years of his life. He stated that in 2009, during a combat mission over Afghanistan, his aircraft had been hit by enemy fire, forcing him to eject over hostile territory. The brief summary suggested a survival story, common enough among combat pilots, but Marcus indicated that what followed the ejection was something he needed to explain in detail because the full story had remained classified for many years and had only recently been declared to a level that permitted public discussion. Steve Harvey's demeanor changed immediately. His characteristic entertaining persona receded as he recognized that Marcus was preparing to share something of profound significance. Steve's voice when he responded carried none of his typical comedic timing or energy, instead reflecting the gravity appropriate to receiving a combat veteran's testimony. He invited Marcus to share whatever he felt comfortable sharing, acknowledging that the studio audience and eventual television viewers would bear witness to his account with appropriate respect. Marcus began his narrative by providing context. The mission on November 12, 2009, had been a close air support operation supporting ground forces engaged in heavy combat in Helmand Province. His aircraft had been struck by a surface-to-air missile that destroyed the left engine and severely damaged flight control systems. He had ejected at approximately 8,000 feet altitude, sustaining injuries during the ejection sequence including compression fractures in his spine, a dislocated shoulder, and lacerations from shrapnel. His parachute descent had placed him approximately 4 miles from the nearest coalition ground forces, in an area known to have significant Taliban presence. Standard procedures dictated that he should establish communication with rescue forces, find defensible terrain, activate his emergency beacon, and await extraction by combat search and rescue teams. The narrative Marcus provided diverged from standard survival stories at this juncture. He explained that during his parachute descent, he had observed what he initially thought was a shepherd with livestock, but quickly recognized as a small group of Afghan civilians, including what appeared to be children, moving across terrain directly in the path of the firefight that had necessitated his close air support mission. The civilians were unaware of the danger they were approaching. Marcus faced an immediate decision upon landing: follow survival protocol by moving away from the landing site to avoid enemy forces who would certainly investigate the downed aircraft, or move toward the civilian group to attempt to warn them about the approaching combat. The choice Marcus made, and the consequences that followed, constituted the core of his survival story. He had moved toward the civilians despite the tactical disadvantage this created for his own survival. He reached the group, which consisted of an elderly man, 2 women, and 3 children ranging in age from approximately 4 to 10 years old, and attempted to communicate the danger through gestures and the limited Pashto phrases he knew. The civilians had been terrified of him initially, seeing an armed American pilot in full flight gear appearing suddenly in their path, but Marcus's urgent gestures toward the sounds of combat and his attempts to redirect them away from the danger had apparently communicated his intent. The elderly man had seemed to understand and began moving the group in the direction Marcus indicated. What occurred next transformed a survival situation into a catastrophic event that would require years of physical and psychological recovery. As Marcus moved with the civilian group to guide them away from the combat zone, they encountered a Taliban patrol that had been moving toward the location of his downed aircraft. The patrol consisted of approximately 8 fighters who immediately recognized Marcus as the downed American pilot, and who also recognized the civilian group as potential leverage or potential casualties that could be attributed to American forces. The situation escalated rapidly. The Taliban fighters surrounded the group, weapons trained on Marcus and the civilians, communicating in Pashto that Marcus could not fully understand, but whose intent was clear from tone and gesture. Marcus described the next sequence of events with clinical precision that suggested he had relived these moments countless times in the 15 years since they occurred. The Taliban fighters had separated him from the civilians and forced him to kneel. One fighter had moved toward the children with clear hostile intent. Marcus had made a decision in that moment that he characterized as instinctive rather than calculated. He had attacked the nearest Taliban fighter despite being restrained, and despite the obvious tactical impossibility of successfully engaging 8 armed combatants while injured and alone. His action had created chaos that allowed the civilians to flee, but it had resulted in Marcus being shot multiple times, beaten severely, and left for dead when the Taliban fighters abandoned the area as coalition quick reaction forces responded to his emergency beacon. The studio audience sat in absolute silence as Marcus described his injuries from the encounter. Multiple gunshot wounds to his torso, severe head trauma from being struck with rifle butts, facial fractures, and burns from an improvised explosive device that the Taliban fighters had attempted to use before fleeing. He had been found by American forces approximately 40 minutes after the encounter, barely alive, with injuries so severe that the initial medical assessment gave him minimal chance of survival, even with immediate trauma care. He had been evacuated to Bagram Airfield, then to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, then to Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, undergoing more than 30 surgical procedures over the subsequent 2 years. Marcus's voice remained steady as he described the medical aftermath, but his hands shook visibly. He explained that he had been in a medically induced coma for 3 weeks following the initial trauma. He had required extensive reconstructive surgery for facial injuries. He had developed severe infections that necessitated additional surgeries and long-term antibiotic therapy. His recovery had required years of physical therapy to regain basic mobility and function. The psychological trauma had manifested as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, major depressive disorder, and survivor's guilt that persisted despite intensive psychiatric treatment. He stated plainly that there had been multiple points during his recovery when he had not wanted to continue living, when the pain and the psychological burden had seemed unbearable, and when only the support of his wife and children had provided sufficient reason to continue the difficult work of healing. Steve Harvey stood motionless throughout Marcus's narrative, his face showing progressive emotional impact as the story unfolded. When Marcus paused, Steve's response was not that of a television host managing a program, but rather that of a human being confronted with testimony of suffering and courage beyond his frame of reference. Steve's voice broke as he asked the question that seemed most pressing. What had happened to the civilians Marcus had attempted to protect? Had his sacrifice achieved its intended purpose? Marcus's expression softened slightly as he responded to this inquiry. He explained that the civilian family had survived. They had fled during the chaos Marcus created and had eventually reached coalition forces, where they had provided information about the American pilot who had tried to help them and who had been attacked while doing so. This information had been included in the intelligence reports that accompanied Marcus's rescue and medical treatment. The family had been relocated for their safety, given their association with American forces. Marcus had not known their ultimate fate for several years, as his medical condition and the classified nature of certain operational details had prevented follow-up investigation. The resolution of this uncertainty represented the reason Marcus had chosen to share his story publicly at this particular time. 6 months prior to the Family Feud taping, Marcus had been contacted by the Department of Defense regarding a request from the Afghan family he had protected in 2009. The family had been among those evacuated from Afghanistan during the American withdrawal in 2021, had been resettled in the United States under special immigration visa provisions due to their assistance to American forces, and had been attempting for 2 years to locate the pilot who had saved their lives 15 years earlier. The bureaucratic process of connecting them had been complicated by classification issues and privacy protections, but clearance had finally been obtained for contact. Marcus described meeting the family in person 3 months before the Family Feud taping. The elderly man had died several years earlier, but the 2 women and the 3 children, now adults in their 20s, had survived and built new lives in America. Meeting them, seeing that they were alive and safe, hearing them express gratitude for his actions, had provided Marcus with something he described as the first real sense of peace regarding the incident. For 15 years, he had questioned whether his decision to protect them rather than prioritizing his own survival had been justified. For 15 years, he had wondered whether they had survived or whether his sacrifice had been meaningless. Meeting them alive and thriving had answered that question definitively. The studio audience was crying openly. Camera operators were wiping tears from their eyes while continuing to film. Steve Harvey stood completely still for several long seconds after Marcus finished speaking, and when he finally moved, it was to walk directly to Marcus and pull him into a tight embrace without speaking. The gesture communicated what words could not adequately express: recognition of sacrifice, acknowledgement of suffering, respect for survival, and gratitude for the willingness to share such profound testimony. When Steve stepped back, his face was wet with tears and his voice was thick with emotion. Steve addressed the cameras and audience with complete abandonment of his entertainer persona. He stated plainly that he could not continue with standard game show proceedings after hearing what Marcus had shared. The story Marcus had told transcended entertainment, transcended competition, transcended any framework that Family Feud typically operated within. Steve explained that Marcus had made a choice in a moment of extreme danger to prioritize civilian lives over his own survival, had suffered catastrophic injuries as a direct result of that choice, had endured years of physical and psychological agony during recovery, and had lived for 15 years not knowing whether his sacrifice had achieved its purpose. The recent discovery that the family had survived and was now safe in America represented a form of redemption that Steve characterized as almost miraculous in its timing and significance. Steve made several decisions in rapid succession. The taping would pause to allow Marcus and his family time to process the emotional impact of having shared this story publicly. Both families competing that day would receive the prize money regardless of game outcome. The Steve Harvey Foundation would connect Marcus with the Afghan family he had saved to facilitate whatever ongoing relationship they wished to build. Most significantly, Steve committed to using his platform to advocate for better support services for combat veterans dealing with the long-term physical and psychological consequences of injuries sustained during service, emphasizing that Marcus's story illustrated both the extraordinary sacrifices made by military personnel and the inadequate support systems available to help them recover from traumatic experiences. The episode aired 10 weeks after the taping, structured as a special presentation focused entirely on Marcus's story rather than as a standard game show episode. Broadcast included additional interview content with Marcus, his wife Catherine describing the years of supporting him through recovery, his former Navy colleague providing context about the mission and the immediate aftermath, and video messages from the Afghan family expressing their gratitude and describing how Marcus's actions had allowed them to live, raise their children, and eventually build new lives in America after fleeing the Taliban regime. Response to the broadcast was substantial and immediate. The clip of Steve Harvey abandoning his host persona to embrace Marcus was viewed hundreds of millions of times across digital platforms within days of the episode airing. Veterans organizations shared the episode as an example of the ongoing impact of combat trauma and the importance of comprehensive long-term support for injured service members. Mental health professionals used Marcus's testimony to illustrate complex post-traumatic stress disorder and the particular challenges faced by veterans whose injuries resulted from split-second decisions made under extreme pressure. The Afghan refugee community responded with appreciation for the positive representation of civilians who had assisted American forces and who continued to face danger as a result of that assistance. Marcus became an advocate for combat veterans dealing with severe physical and psychological injuries. He spoke at medical conferences about the long-term recovery process and the importance of integrating physical and mental health treatment. He testified before congressional committees about gaps in veteran healthcare services and about the need for better support during the transition from active duty to civilian life for those medically retired due to combat injuries. He worked with organizations supporting Afghan refugees, helping to connect former interpreters and other Afghans who had assisted American forces with resources for building new lives in the United States. The relationship between Marcus and the Afghan family he had saved developed into something both men described as transformative for their respective healing processes. The eldest son, who had been 10 years old at the time of the incident, had become a physician and worked in a community health center serving refugee populations. The daughter, who had been approximately 6 years old, had become a teacher working with immigrant and refugee children. Both spoke publicly about how Marcus's sacrifice had given them the opportunity to survive, to be educated, to build careers dedicated to helping others, and to raise their own families in safety. They emphasized that his decision to protect them rather than prioritizing his own survival had given multiple generations the chance to exist, that his children and their children would never have been born if he had not acted as he did. Marcus reflected in interviews that meeting the family and learning about the lives they had built provided the answer to a question that had haunted him for 15 years. Had the price he paid been worth it? For years, he had struggled with the possibility that his sacrifice might have been meaningless, that the civilians might not have survived despite his actions, that he had endured catastrophic injury and destroyed his military career for an outcome that made no difference. Learning that they had survived, that they had built good lives, that they credited him with giving them the opportunity to exist beyond that day in 2009, had allowed him to make peace with the consequences of his decision in ways that years of therapy had not achieved. Steve Harvey spoke frequently in subsequent interviews about his response to Marcus's story and about why he had broken from his typical hosting approach. He explained that in decades of entertainment work, he had developed the ability to maintain professional distance even when hearing difficult stories, to manage his emotional responses in service of the program format. Marcus's testimony had penetrated that professional distance completely. Steve characterized the moment of hearing Marcus describe being beaten and shot while protecting children, of hearing him describe years of excruciating recovery, of hearing him describe the psychological torment of not knowing whether his sacrifice had mattered, as experiencing a level of emotional impact that made continuing with entertainment format impossible. Steve emphasized that Marcus's story illustrated the reality that combat service involves moral complexity and psychological burden that persist long after physical wounds heal. The decision Marcus had made to prioritize civilian lives over his own survival had been both heroic and devastating. The heroism did not erase the cost. The survival did not eliminate the trauma. The eventual discovery that the family had lived did not undo 15 years of uncertainty and suffering. Steve used his platform to advocate for public understanding that supporting veterans required more than thanking them for their service, that it required acknowledging the ongoing burden many carried, and providing comprehensive resources for managing that burden across entire lifetimes. 5 years after the Family Feud episode, Marcus participated in a documentary examining long-term outcomes for combat veterans who sustained severe injuries during the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts. He spoke candidly about his continuing physical limitations, chronic pain that required daily management, psychological symptoms that waxed and waned but never fully resolved, and the ways that the events of November 2009 continued to influence his life 15 years later. He also spoke about the positive developments, including his advocacy work, his relationship with the Afghan family, and his role in supporting other injured veterans through their recovery processes. The documentary included a reunion between Marcus and the Afghan family, filmed at a community center where they gathered to celebrate the Eid holiday. The footage showed Marcus interacting naturally with the family, participating in their celebration, playing with the younger generation of children who existed because he had protected their parents 2 decades earlier. The eldest son, now a physician, spoke about how every patient he treated represented a way of honoring the gift Marcus had given his family, a way of extending the impact of that sacrifice by helping others as he had been helped. The daughter, now a teacher, explained that she told her students about the American pilot who had risked everything to protect her when she was a child, using the story to teach about courage, about choosing to help others even at great personal cost, about the connections that transcend nationality and conflict. Marcus reflected on the evolution of his understanding of what had occurred in 2009 and what it meant for his ongoing life. He explained that initially he had framed the incident primarily through the lens of his own suffering, focusing on what he had lost and endured. Therapy had gradually shifted his perspective to include recognition of what his actions had preserved, the lives that continued because of his choice. Meeting the family had completed that shift, transforming an abstract understanding that he had probably saved lives into concrete knowledge of specific individuals who were alive because of his decision. This knowledge did not eliminate his physical pain or psychological symptoms, but it provided a framework for integrating his suffering into a broader narrative that included meaning and purpose. 10 years after the Family Feud episode, Marcus was invited to speak at the Naval Academy about ethics, decision-making under pressure, and the long-term consequences of combat service. He stood before a room full of midshipmen who would soon face their own decisions about how to respond to danger, how to balance mission priorities with protection of civilian lives, how to manage the aftermath of traumatic experiences. He told them about November 2009, about the choice he had made, about the price he had paid, about the 15 years of uncertainty, about the redemption of learning the family had survived. He emphasized that he would make the same choice again despite knowing the full cost, that protecting those children had been the right decision regardless of consequences to himself, but that he wanted them to understand that doing the right thing under extreme circumstances did not prevent suffering, did not guarantee good outcomes, and did not resolve moral complexity. Marcus concluded his Naval Academy address with a message about survival and its meanings. He explained that surviving the gunshots and beating in 2009 had been only the first challenge, that surviving the years of medical treatment and psychological trauma had required different forms of courage, that surviving the uncertainty about whether his sacrifice had mattered had perhaps been the most difficult challenge of all. He told the midshipmen that if they entered combat, some would face situations that required choosing between their own survival and other imperatives, that these choices would shape the rest of their lives regardless of which option they selected, and that the military and broader society had an obligation to support them through the long aftermath of such decisions. He encouraged them to seek help when they needed it, to speak honestly about their experiences and struggles, and to recognize that survival encompassed not just continuing to live, but building lives worth living despite carrying the weight of difficult experiences. The comprehensive nature of Marcus's survival story, the 15-year arc from the initial incident through uncertainty and pain to eventual resolution and meaning-making, illustrated the temporal complexity of trauma recovery. His willingness to share the story publicly on Family Feud, and Steve Harvey's authentic response to that testimony, created a moment that transcended typical boundaries between entertainment and genuine human encounter. The subsequent advocacy work, policy changes, and individual healing that flowed from that public disclosure demonstrated the potential power of veterans sharing their experiences when appropriate platforms and respectful reception create conditions for meaningful witnessing. Recognition that combat service involves experiences that may require decades to process and integrate. Acknowledgement that physical survival of traumatic events represents only the beginning of a longer journey towards psychological and spiritual survival. And commitment to providing comprehensive long-term support for veterans navigating this journey should inform societal responses to military service and sacrifice. Marcus Hayes demonstrated that sharing survival stories requires courage equal to the courage required to survive the original events, that the question of whether sacrifice was worthwhile may take years to answer, and that healing occurs not through forgetting or minimizing traumatic experiences, but through integrating them into a broader life narrative that includes meaning, connection, and purpose. Steve Harvey's departure from his professional persona to respond authentically to Marcus's testimony showed that bearing witness to survival stories sometimes requires abandoning the scripts and structures that normally govern our interactions in favor of genuine human response that honors the gravity of what is being shared. Support for this work should manifest through advocacy for comprehensive veteran healthcare services, funding for research into effective treatments for combat-related post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury, creation of peer support networks connecting veterans with similar experiences, and cultivation of cultural understanding that supporting veterans requires sustained commitment rather than performative gestures of appreciation. The recognition that one person's choice to protect civilians in a moment of danger created ripple effects that extended across decades and across generations, allowing families to survive and thrive and build futures that would not otherwise have existed, provides powerful illustration of how individual moral choices in extreme circumstances can have impacts that far exceed what can be known in the moment of decision.